This video is going to look at violence in sport. And if we have a look at your specification, you need to know the causes of violence for performers and spectators, the implications of violence in sport for those three areas again, society, sport and performers, and also the strategies to prevent violence. So strategies that are used to prevent violence in players and also spectators. But before we start, we need to know what violence is. Now, when we're talking about this, we're talking about an intense physical force that's directed towards harming an individual, a group, or property. So just think back to that as we're working through these slides. So first thing we're going to look at are the causes of violence in players. What makes players violent? Now, a nice easy way to remember this is using the acronym WINNER. So W is for the win ethic, the pressure to win. There's high rewards for success, players want to win, and violence can occur because of that pressure. We've then got the importance of the event. So there's more likely to be violence at local derbies or in a cup final because of the importance placed on that event by the players and the spectators. The nature of the sport, some sports are more physical, such as rugby, and might result in more violent behaviour on the field. National governing bodies are sometimes too lenient with punishments, so athletes know they can be violent and get away with it. We've got E, the excitement or over-arousal, or even the negative use of PEDs, which can result in aggression. So if you think about steroids, can result in things like roid rage. And we've got R, the refereeing decisions leading to frustration. So poor refereeing decisions makes people more violent. Now, it's a nice, easy way to remember the different ways that athletes become violent. But there are other factors you could bring in, such as retaliation against an opponent for a bad tackle. So this isn't an extensive list, but there is other things you could talk about as well. So now we're going to look at the causes of violence in spectators. So for spectators, we've got the I factors. So each of these begin with an I. So we've got inhibitions. They might lose their inhibitions because they've been taking drugs or drinking alcohol before a game. The importance, so winning the game is important. So if you think about Celtic versus Rangers football, there's always media hype, social media especially now, building that hype up before a match. We've got individuality. So what we mean by individuality is this loss of responsibility when they're in a large group. So it could be football hooligans. Once they're in a big group, they can attack others. They feel like they're representing or protecting their own town against rival teams. Then we've got imitation. It could just be copying the violence they've witnessed on the field of play. Could be increased frustration at poor officiating, negative chants from rival fans winding them up. The fact their team's losing, so violence against those opposition fans is a form of catharsis or release of aggression because they're so frustrated with how their team are doing. But again, there are other factors. These I factors, again, are a nice way of ticking off key words that are going to be on the mark scheme, but there are other factors, of course. Poor spectator provision, so if it's overcrowded or there's poor policing or stewardship there might be more violence as a result. There could be cultural group divisions. So if we look at Real Madrid and Atletico Bilbao, really hate each other, their fans, and it links all the way back to the Civil War. So there are other cultural factors that might be considered to cause violence as well. So I love this photo. The implications of violence in sport. So we're going to have to look at the impact of violence in sport on society, on sport, and on the performers as well. So we're going to look at sport and its effect on society first. Okay, so how does violence in sport affect society? So violent actions on the pitch should really be treated with the same sort of level of punishment as violent acts on the street. And the same law should be applied equally to both off the field and on the field. So sports performers are role models. Okay, so violence may end up getting copied in society as well. A lot of young kids look up to sports performers, and it's likely that's going to be copied off the field by young kids. It could put off parents letting their children participate in a certain sport. I know my wife's seen quite a few violent acts in rugby games, American football games. She's like, right, they are not playing that sport at all. It can also lead to violence among spectators. So if you're seeing violence in sport, then that might escalate into spectators in society also showing violent behaviour. And sport is really a reflection of our society. So if there's violence in sport, it might be because society has violence in it, or that's what our society wants to see. Especially if you think about things like the increase in MMA and cage fighting, then is that what our society wants to see? Is that why it's becoming so popular? Is it because we're a violent society mainly? And also, violence in sport could indicate other social issues in wider society. For example, there is a strong link between football results, so when England lose, for example, and an increase in domestic violence. So, does violence in sport indicate there are wider issues in our society? So, now we're going to look at the implications of violence in sport for sport itself. So, it can bring about changes in laws, changes in the rules of a sport to make violence less likely. Sport can receive a bad name as well, or a bad profile as a result of violence. And this can result in things like reduced participation or a loss of sponsors. They don't want to have their brand damaged. So regular violence is going to affect any future sponsorship or future investments from businesses. Again, if there's more violence, the public aren't going to end up following the sport that much. They're going to lose interest in it and go and watch something else. However, some people say it can make the sport more entertaining. Okay, for media, for the spectators, if there is a bit of violence in there. And it's even happened that teams get banned for violence. Back in 1985, Liverpool were banned for 6 years from European competitions for violence between their fans and Juventus fans. So 6-year ban from European competition for spectator violence. And finally, we're going to look at the impact for performers. Now, performers are obviously going to get punished. It could be disciplinary action, it could be legal action as a result of it. It can also result in injury and even deaths in some cases if it is really violent. It could result in a career-ending injury for a certain person. And if they are being violent, their sponsors are likely to pull their sponsorship deals from that player because they don't want to be associated with violent behaviour. And they're going to be seen as a negative role model, someone you do not want to look up to. And that's going to be detrimental to their career even after sport as well. Next thing we're going to look at then are the strategies that are being put in place to prevent violence. That's violence in players and spectators. So for players, there are a lot of things being put in place. There's rule changes, okay, to try and minimise violent situations in sport. So we've got things like no high tackles in rugby now. And you've got things like VAR coming into play. So players know they can't get away with being violent because they're going to get caught. We've got punishments. They're becoming more severe. Match bans, season bans, acting as a deterrent, potential legal action in certain sports as a result of violent behaviour. Education is a big thing now, okay? Educating players about fair play and their position as role models, trying to educate them on the negative effects that violence is going to have and how also to control their emotions and control the stress that is leading to those aggressive outbursts. We've got more effective officiating, so to try and maintain more control over the game, try and stop those violent acts. The officials are now more qualified, given higher levels of training. We've got more officials on the pitch now and on the sides of the pitch than ever before. And we've also got things like VAR in place as well. And that's where we come on to technology. There's far fairer outcomes. Okay, we've got video referees to try and catch any foul play after an event as well. So there's retrospective action that can try and stop players becoming violent. And for coaches, we're trying to encourage this philosophy within coaches of being assertive. So going in hard, but not being violent. And also we've got sports psychologists. Most professional sports clubs now have sports psychologists on board to help athletes with techniques such as self-talk and relaxation to try and use those before they become violent. So then there's also strategies in place to try and prevent violence from spectators as well. There are far, far stricter punishments now. Fans who are being violent have their season tickets removed, there's legal action, they're not allowed to travel abroad. You've got the Football Disorder Act from 2000, which allows police to arrest anyone who's identified as a potential troublemaker. You've got the control of alcohol. There's searches at gates, banning alcohol at matches, having earlier kick-off times to prevent people coming in drunk and being violent as a result. There's better facilities as well. We've now got all-seater stadiums, so fans are a little bit more under control. They can't be standing up, moving around much because of those seats. They've also separated home fans, away fans in football, for example, are now separated. It doesn't happen in every sport. Rugby fans generally are mixed, but in certain sports where there's a history of violence, separating them seems to work. We've got CCTV and police handheld cameras to try and spot incidents occurring and record any events for evidence. And there's also a big emphasis on liaison and law enforcement of police. So sharing information between clubs and police on things like potential troublemakers, putting in football banning orders for home and abroad fixtures so fans who are troublemakers can't travel to those games and cause more violent behaviour. And also promoting sport as family entertainment, using family sections within the crowd, having children's-based entertainment like mascots and competitions at half-time. Try and use social media to build up a positive relationship between the sport and fans and less focus on that violent and aggressive behaviour. So we'll have a little look at this a bit more detail in class. That's the end of this video.